Okay, let me just, as an outline, where I'm going to touch upon in what is essentially the next hour. And I will, as I said, hopefully go from sort of a macro picture to a little bit more sort of maybe micro picture. I should also say, as part of my background, for those of you, I noticed on in one of the discussions, cluster strategies, and I'm expect for those who have been involved in economic development, you have worked on the building of industrial clusters. I spent 5 years working with Professor Michael Porter of the Harvard Business School, who helped make popular the concept of clusters as an economic development strategy, and so have worked a lot on how we build regional clusters and particularly clusters of innovation in the US, as well as some work in Brazil. So just a little bit of background there in case there are questions or discussion around that topic. So let me begin with what I know all of you are living and well aware of in terms of some of the major trends that I believe are behind a new policy agenda and approaches to economic development. The first is supply chains. You have lived this. We all have lived this during the pandemic, but then, of course, Ukraine has lived this through the war. But what the global pandemic did for all of us was expose vulnerabilities in global supply chains. From our PPE, that's our personal protective equipment for our first responders, to semiconductors, so from low value added to high value added products, we saw tremendous problems for the US in terms of protecting sort of national and economic security. And supply chain vulnerabilities, I think, are now a new way in which we are looking at our economies. So 10 years before the pandemic, if you had said that 90% of the most advanced semiconductor chips in the US economy were sourced from one company in one region of the world, that's TSMC in Taiwan, people knew this very well, but they did not see it as a problem. Today, we see this as a problem. And I think we are trying to find ways to look at our economy and be able to look around the corner and see where are these vulnerabilities. So when I was at the White House, we had enormous backup at the ports of LA and Long Beach, could not get, goods in, concerned that people, would not receive their gifts for Christmas. We got through that. We said, oh, okay, we can relax. And then, of course, we had Russia's invasion of Ukraine, which disrupted energy, agriculture, mineral supply chains. And what, of course, is clear and what you all know well is that there are always supply chain vulnerabilities. We've now seen this in the Middle East. And we can expect, and McKinsey has said, global companies will expect disruptions for, at least every 4 years. I think now that's probably accelerated. And if we look at, part of the ways in which supply chains have been organized historically, there are, they've been very global in nature. We have our large companies, like the ones that I've presented here, that have thousands and thousands of suppliers. And what we learned through the pandemic is they have very little transparency into that supply chain. They might know their first tier suppliers, which are the ones in the orange. So these are their large suppliers that they are often most engaged with, and also often innovating as well. But they have no idea what's happening in this third, fourth, and fifth tier. And in fact, a lot of tier companies consider this their competitive advantage, so they keep this information to themselves. But that creates complications in moments of trying to understand where the vulnerabilities are. And as a country, it creates complications. So we didn't have. Oh, somebody needs to. Could somebody mute, please?
Ось, я
I'll
дуже перепрошую, пані Марія, вимкніть мікрофон.
She's muted. You can continue.
Thank you. So this idea of transparency in supply chains now very important, not important for companies, but also important for countries. We need to be able to look around the corner and say, where do we see vulnerabilities? So in the US case, for example, we've now focused, as a country on rebuilding and thinking about resilience in our supply chains in semiconductors, in clean energy, in critical minerals. But for all of this, we just had one of the largest hurricanes hit through the country, Hurricane Helene, and wiped out the only factory in the United States that provides IV fluid to hospitals. So we've had a crisis in IV fluid, one company, one factory. This is not sustainable in the future, and we have to find ways in which we can kind of rebuild in these areas. So as I think about, when we think about supply chain resilience, some work by my colleague, David Simchi-Levy here at MIT, has come up with new metrics for thinking about what does resilience mean in our supply chains. So he uses two metrics: time to survive, how long do you have inventory on hand or available to sustain through a disruption, and time to recover, how long does it take you to get back to full production. And what his work has shown, and we know through bullwhip effects, if people are familiar with that term, that if you're just 10 days down for a semiconductor firm in Taiwan right now, it almost is a full year before you're back to production because of the time in that supply chain that is built in and that it takes to replenish. And this is in fact why we saw several years of supply chain backup and frankly, I think impact on inflation globally is because of this bullwhip effect, what happens when you have a delay in a supply chain. So important now for companies and countries to be thinking about how do we build resilience? And there are a number of strategies that I think are being deployed. So the first point is to say there's no single optimal way. I think if you were to look at the literature, you would say, is it just a couple suppliers? Is it multiple suppliers? Is it multiple countries? Is it just a few countries? There are multiple ways to organize supply chains. But what we do see happening today is first and foremost this increase in transparency. And I think that when I jumped on the last on the call just earlier, people were talking about digital transformation, digitalization. This is a key piece to supply chain resilience, because if you have the connective thread across the supply chain, you are able to both not only know, where your production is today, but you can anticipate and predict, particularly with AI capabilities, what you imagine the future will look like and what are your possible pathways forward if a disruption occurs. So transparency, redundancy, the power of two, so not just one supplier, but two that you can rely upon, and then regionalization. So rather than one long supply chain globally, you may think about hubs, a hub in North America, a hub in Eastern Europe, a hub in Asia, et cetera, and that you, again, reduce the impact of a disruption if you look at a hub model. Sustainability is also still key as a priority. Companies are trying to look for ways to reduce their demand for energy. Of course, we see that increasing in terms of compute power and the need for more energy. But sustainability and reducing greenhouse gases, also a key effort. And most of that, the greenhouse gases for companies is in their supply chain, not necessarily in their own production, but actually in the supply chain. So again, a key piece to that is that you need to be able to understand how you're going to reduce those emissions or increase that transparency. We need a digital thread. We need to be able to measure within firms, actually what's going on. And again, I think AI will be an important tool in this process. So after supply chain disruptions, the next factor or trend I want to talk about is climate change. And of course, climate change is an existential threat to the globe, But if you didn't believe, if you didn't believe in climate change, which in the US, we sadly have leaders who don't believe in climate change, what you would understand is that the economic impacts are growing through negative weather effects. So in 2023, we saw the largest number of natural disasters that topped over $1 billion in cost to the economy. We had 28 of them in 2023. They totaled up to close to about $100 billion in cost. And this year, of course, we've had now a couple that have just one hurricane itself has been estimated at 200 billion. So this is a trend that we sadly can expect to continue. And it means that in rebuilding, when we think about rebuilding, we have to think in terms of resilience with respect to climate. And that has a lot of implications for where we build and how we build. And there is an opportunity here to rebuild a more resilient supply chain, a more resilient infrastructure based on climate-related factors. Third, the geopolitical landscape. I don't have to explain to all of you how things are changing dramatically and how they have just in the last year or two. But suffice it to say that the conflict in the Ukraine, in Middle East, and the tensions that we've seen between the US and China in the South China Sea are leading to significant re-examinations of global and national vulnerabilities. In Europe, of course, Russia's invasion of Ukraine has led to a rethinking of their energy supply chains. In the US, these tensions has led to a real urgency around the building of the defense industrial base in the US. Obviously, the US has been supplying Ukraine. It's also been supplying Israel. And what's become clear is a sense that there's concern that the US is not actually in its defense industrial base is not where it needs to be to support a policy of deterrence, particularly with China in the South China Sea. There's a focus now to how to accelerate and build not just innovation. And in fact, as you all may know, the conflict in Ukraine has, if anything, accelerated innovation in a number of areas, drones, et cetera, things that have not been actually occurring in the US. And so there is a real focus on how to innovate, how to modernize the industrial base, and also how to just build more capacity in the US, that we've had a shrinking supply chain for the defense industrial base. But this whole question of what should defense industrial bases look like going forward is not a question that's just left to the US, but we see investments and questions being raised in Europe and Asia as well. Of course, in the US also, we have these rising tensions with China. This has been exacerbated, I think, on two fronts. One is the question of where China wants to be sort of in a geopolitical sense, but also on an economic sense. So concerns about overcapacity and overproduction in China, and whether there's a chance of sort of dumping products on the global economy in semiconductors and EVs, so that the US has taken steps, but Europe has taken steps, Brazil has taken steps, a number of countries concerned about China's export strategy. China, of course, dominates in critical industries, critical minerals, some of which are produced in Russia and Ukraine. But 60% of the lithium industry globally, 80% of the cobalt industry, these are critical inputs. So again, that's driving a lot of rethinking about how can we substitute for some of these? How can we increase domestic production? What is the role of technology in actually trying to improve the way we mine and refine critical minerals, and an opportunity there, I think, for a lot of innovation and rethinking supply chains. And then, of course, the Chinese approach to building new industries and technology has been to support billions and billions of dollars of subsidies and scale up financing for the economy, which is not the model that we have in other countries. And so there's a challenge there as to, technological advancement and supremacy on that front. Fourth, and finally, I want to just make note of the growing issues around income inequality. The trends on income inequality are not unique to the US. They're a little bit more muted in Europe, but we have seen increasing income inequality in certainly in developed economies around the world. In large part, what we see in the US is essentially a redistribution of wages. So wages from the lower and middle income workers have really shifted toward higher income workers. And this is, of course, I think populism, at the root of populism is economic insecurity. And we've seen a lot of threats to social fabric of different societies, threats to democracy, the rise of autocracy. And at the core of this, I believe, is a sense of economic insecurity. I'm going to show some data from the US that sort of, I think, crystallizes what the challenge is here. And this is looking at growth rates between productivity growth rate and compensation growth rates in the US from about 1950 to 2020. And if you were to look at those two top lines, you'd say productivity per hour and average compensation. You say, well, compensation growth is roughly tracking productivity growth. You know, this looks okay. This is what we'd expect. But if we were to take out of that average compensation, anyone who had a 4-year college degree, which in the US is about 40% of the population, you'd get the median compensation, what the typical worker is getting, and that's that red line. If you were to take out, you know, even supervisory roles, so you know, just your workers sort of on the front lines, if you will, you have that blue line. And what we see is what we call the Great Divergence in about the early 1980s. And we understand that the compensation for the typical worker has for about 40 years remained relatively flat relative to the rest of the society. And this, I think, is at the core of a lot of the tensions in the US and a lot of the political direction we see the country going, is this sense that a lot of workers and places in the country have been left behind. And the implications for this are very serious when it comes to our political economy and our social institutions, I believe, and our trust in the institutions. So this is an area that I think also has been at the fore of certainly of the Biden administration, and a lot of the work that the Biden administration has done in the last 4 years has been to try and address this divergence and what can be done for typical workers through public policy, through investments in communities, et cetera. So these 4 trends: supply chain vulnerabilities, climate threats, geopolitical tensions, and growing income inequality, together, in my mind, are what are driving toward a new policy paradigm for the US and for many other countries. So what does this look like? What does this mean? So in the US, what this has meant is an investment in industrial policy. I think Europe is much more comfortable with industrial policy, or has been for many decades. In the US, even though industrial policy was at the founding of the country, Alexander Hamilton in the 1780s wrote a paper on the importance of manufacturing. In the US, this has been out of favor. As many of you know, sort of the neoliberal Washington consensus has looked at, you know, less government, less regulation, the free market, if you will. But what we've understood again, in many places, is that the private market left to its own devices can tend to underinvest in areas of the economy that have a strategic and economic significance. And so how can we use government resources to make investments that attract private capital to address these priorities? Because, of course, government will never have enough government money to rebuild competitive industries. We need to use what we have to leverage private sector investment. And that, in fact, is what the Biden administration has done in the last couple of years, in many ways with bipartisan support. And what we see in in many countries is that this emphasis on supply chains, this rethinking of globalization, has globalization really helped that typical worker? How should we rethink global agreements so that both the planet and workers are, our center to those conversations? And how do we invest in critical industries? So you are largely, I'm sure, familiar with the semiconductor efforts now. We're seeing investments around the EU, the US, Japan, South Korea, to the point that people are concerned about oversupply. But of course, demand is very strong in this area. Clean energy, another area, again, where we're seeing significant investments and incentives to bring new capital into solar, into EVs, into wind, geothermal, nuclear, and then defense. And that's self-evident. You're all aware of that. U.S. policies, just to speak to this in case people are thinking about, well, what kind of policies might we deploy in Ukraine going forward? There have been a number of tools that have been used, and I think they've been around for a while, whether it's a supply side push or a demand side pull. So tax credits that allow companies to write off some of their investments for new manufacturing facilities, and those tax incentives can increase over time if you invest in a economically disadvantaged area, if you provide some training or better wages to workers. We have some Made in America requirements that have been around sort of basic infrastructure. Steel and iron, for example, have a Made in America requirement for infrastructure. Some of the batteries, trying to build a battery supply chain in the US also has some incentives that way, but also a lot of different, what I'd call workarounds, if you will, because we have no battery production in the US. So this is a little bit of aspirational. And then these public dollars have really been quite successful in attracting private dollars. So Goldman Sachs right now estimates that the US public and private investment in clean energy over the next decade will be close to $3 trillion, which is about a huge huge leverage there. So interesting to see. If you only thought that, if you only measured success based on that, then you'd say, oh, the policies have been very successful. But of course, to recreate the kinds of investments and the continued inequality in the US is not the goal here. We need to rebuild in a different way. We need to rebuild in a better way. This is just an example of what I think these incentives for clean energy investment have done in the last couple of years. We've seen significant investments in building a battery industry. This has all been with joint ventures with non-US headquartered companies. We also see investments in critical minerals. We also see solar also as a key area that has been invested in. All right, let me switch here to what I'm calling the new industrial revolution. Of course, we talk about the industrial revolution of the 1800s and what happened in the US and in Europe. But really what we see right now is a confluence of events that are leading to a new sense of what advanced manufacturing is going to look like. So it's now, to the extent that manufacturing has been sort of the bread and butter of a lot of developing countries. I think what we're seeing now is that advanced manufacturing is bringing the possibility of different types of manufacturing back to developed countries, and hopefully that is not a zero-sum game for the developing world, but it is essentially leading to more innovation and more opportunity. And I think the three things that I've listed here that are most driving this, or one is, what does resilience look like? It turns out that having your manufacturing around the world spread out has some risks for companies. They're also focused on sustainability. We have, if most of our greenhouse gases are coming from an industrial base, we have to figure out how to address this. And then digitalization, as I mentioned before. Cybersecurity, another major challenge that countries are trying to address, but really it's company by company security systems and behaviors that I think are going to help address cybersecurity risks. And then finally, I'll talk at the end about augmenting workers. And I promise not to talk for maybe another 10 minutes so that we have plenty of time for discussion. But I just wanted to, I'm going to put out a number of these ideas. But how do we use this technology to actually augment workers and not just replace them? So again, here are just two reports that came out in the last year focused on manufacturing. The left side from the defense industry or the defense community and the defense and Department of Defense in the US. And on the other side are actually our national academies. So our sort of scientific and technology association for academia, also talking about smart manufacturing and the importance of this. So just a couple highlights here, sorry, to get this straight. So first, just to say, what is advanced manufacturing, just so we know what we're talking about. When I think about advanced manufacturing, it's both technologies themselves, so that's robotics, 3D printing, but it's also production systems as a whole. How are we shifting the way we make things, right? And they're converging to create these new products and processes. Many of you will be familiar with the term Industry 4.0, which a lot of people think has not done us a service internationally, in that it's been too broad a term and really hasn't delivered as people had thought it would when it was first invented by the Germans. This is technologies, as I said, that are about automation, AI, robotics, better compute, all sorts of ways in which we're changing the way we manufacture. We also see this opportunity for distributed manufacturing. So rather than have the huge facility, large CapEx, large footprint, which creates its own risks, can we have smaller footprints, higher yields, a little bit more flexible manufacturing footprint? And it really need to think that this is what's going on here is a sort of a generational replacement, that we will see this transformation occur. It will not happen overnight. It will take decades. And in fact, it's taking, already, if you think about the last decade, we're just in the first inning. We're just beginning, I think, in this transformation. But it is focused on being more green, being more resilient, being more digital. And as I said before, the industrial sector, if you put energy, transportation, manufacturing together, generates about 70% of the greenhouse gases. So it's a really significant area, not just for transformation, but also for R&D. And in fact, what we're seeing, certainly at MIT, is a lot of interesting R&D going on into material science, into sort of the industrial base for the country, like in cement, in steel, in aluminum, to try and think about how do we rebuild in these areas. And that has implications as well for requirements that we're starting to see in terms of clean production. And if people are familiar with CBAM, the cross-border adjustment mechanism that the EU just passed for commodities being sold into the EU, that will start to require companies to actually understand how things are made and reduce their carbon footprint in a lot of this industrial sector. So just a couple trends that I think help also put Ukraine's manufacturing base in context going forward. Sorry, my suite here is not as organized here, but first, labor shortages. What we're finding in the US and parts of Europe, Asia, we have, because of aging workforce, because of lower fertility rates, we see a shortage of workers in the manufacturing space. In the US, they estimate that there'll be 2 million unfilled manufacturing jobs by 2030. So a lot of these technologies are important for for addressing that labor shortage, and they can help. But what they also do is actually lead to the upskilling of workers. What we know is that if companies invest in new technology, they tend to invest in training their existing workforce on that new technology. So it has a virtuous cycle. And it also helps increase productivity, which of course is important for rising wages. And that's what we see also in the US, is that the wage premium in manufacturing has not kept up with the rest of the economy. It's become less attractive for workers as a place to work. So adoption of Industry 4.0, as I said, this term has become a little muddled because it's so broad in nature. But what we also see is just a highly uneven adoption. So a number of countries have really advanced on their adoption of robotics. And, it goes from China, which has been focused on driving productivity, to Japan, who just has been short of workers and needs more robotics. But a whole range of ways in which countries are adopting this technology. In the US, I would just say that the US has been a laggard. While we're strong on the innovation, the adoption has been a real challenge. So, just about a quarter of businesses are actually in digital transformation, in the leadership there. We just don't see the kind of connectivity to the cloud, et cetera, as you might find in other countries. And this is important, particularly for the small and medium-sized manufacturer. And I'm going to guess that there are many of those in Ukraine. In the US, this is the backbone of the country, but understandably, these companies have little, free cash flow. They are adverse. They have risk aversion to adopting new technology. But really, their future and their survival requires adopting some of this, sensors and data collection so that they actually can improve their yields and safety and productivity. So the focus on the small and medium-sized firm is an area that I have been very engaged in and very focused on. And it is, I think, one of the more challenging areas for building a manufacturing base. All right, let me just switch because I'm sure, everyone is aware of this issue that we've had certainly historically, and that is this fear of technology and its impact on workers and work. So this is a billboard that I passed for a year driving into MIT, which was put up by an insurance company. And I think it's a very funny billboard, but at the same time, it captured the zeitgeist of the time of 2018, which was this fear that, the robots are coming, they're going to come and take all of our jobs. We're going to need a universal basic income because there will be no work. And so, we're all in trouble. But what we understood ultimately, I think, is that the challenge for the US and for many places is not necessarily the quantity of jobs, but the quality of jobs. And that, in fact, if we had had more robots during the pandemic, we might have saved more lives. And now, of course, instead of robots, people can talk about AI and the concerns about AI taking jobs. I think we ultimately need to explore all of this technology as tools. And to the extent that workers master the tools, they can help, augment workers. So this is work that we did at MIT under the auspices of a task force called the MIT Task Force on the Work of the Future. That work came out in 2020, 2021. We published a book as well. And just to highlight a couple of those key points in this work, let me just say a few things on that front. And I understand that this may not be front and center for Ukraine as an issue, but I think it is important for us to understand the relationship between investing in technology and investing in workers. So the first point to make is that technological change is both replacing work, but also creating new work. It's not eliminating work altogether. So if we were to look at the US economy today, we'd see that over 60% of the jobs that exist today did not exist 80 years ago. 50% of the jobs in manufacturing today did not exist 80 years ago. We have technology is helping us create new jobs, new opportunities, whether it's in drones, whether it's as social influencers. We see that kind of evolution occurring in the economy. Secondly, this point I made earlier about labor productivity and increases in productivity haven't necessarily led to broad increases in income across society. And there are a number of reasons for this. Again, people will be familiar. One, technological change. Technology has tended to be beneficial for the more educated as a tool, but been a replacement for a lot of less educated workers, more routine work. So in manufacturing, obviously automation, in clerical work, computers have taken the jobs of a lot of secretaries, et cetera. So we've seen this development of what we might call a barbell economy. So a loss of jobs in the middle, a growth of jobs in low income work, a growth in jobs in high income work. So that has hollowed out the middle in some ways. Globalization also, of course, having an impact certainly on manufacturing economies, and the introduction of China and the powerhouse that China has been in manufacturing has had a leveling effect on manufacturing. It's affected not only the offshoring of manufacturing, but wages. And for the US, it's had very devastating effects for communities and for generations, just intergenerational impact on workers of losing that industrial base. And we haven't historically done a great job in addressing that as the country. I think we're doing a better job today. But the third point is what we call labor market institutions. That would be, minimum wage, worker protections, unemployment insurance, healthcare, the basic pieces to supporting workers, which we find, much more robust in, for example, Scandinavia than we do in the US. That in fact is, in the end, what really helps workers through technological change. So every country is facing technological change, obviously at different rates. Every country is facing the impacts of the global economy and globalization, but countries differ, very significantly in terms of the institutions that are in place for workers. And we certainly have seen, the impact, the outcome for workers in Europe versus the US. Workers have fared better in Europe. People say, well, the trade-off there is that there's less innovation and there's more economic growth in the US. The idea here is that actually we can have growth and support for workers, and that is a better path forward, and leads to, I think, a little bit more social harmony. But in the end, our report and our work at the task force was that it's the institutions that are helping workers really try and address the ways in which we can help transition an economy toward a more technology-based. I want to then finally close with a point around technological change, just to say that this sense that the technology is coming and it's going to lead to mass unemployment, or it's going to profoundly change the way we do things overnight, is just not the way we've seen technology roll out. If people will remember 10 years ago that autonomous vehicles were going to be taking over our streets, and at least in the US, we would have no need for truck drivers anymore. Not turned out to be the case. We really are desperate for more truck drivers, and autonomous trucking, which is, we will see that day, but it's decades away from having any meaningful impact on the labor force. AI, of course, quicker to be adopted, but even there, we're seeing a lot of glitches as people, the Ukrainians very strong in the software space understand, this is an imperfect technology and you can ask the same question 3 different ways and get 3 different answers. So we're not at a place where we can think that that's going to easily replace workers overnight. So with that, I think I'm leaving us hopefully plenty of time for discussion. I've seen a couple questions come through the chat, but really hope that this at least has given some food for thought, and I'm happy to dive, more deeply into any part of what I've just spoken about.
У нас є 2 питання, вони англійською в чаті. Якщо можна, давайте почнемо з них.
We have 2 questions. They are in English in the chat, so you can read them.
Okay, great. So let me start with the first question. What resources can Ukraine as a state?
Hello, that resources can Ukraine as a state, the rest of countries?
Yep. Countries like the US.
Yes.
In order to attract investments and develop more fruitful cooperation. Well, first, let me just say that I think there's a tremendous amount of goodwill and interest in working with Ukraine and helping rebuild. And I think that this should happen at 2 levels. I think actually at 3 levels. So I think there will be, there's hopefully a level at the federal government level. I will say that we don't know right now. We have a new administration coming in, led by President-elect Trump. We really don't have any idea what his priorities will be and what that looks like. But the support for Ukraine is very strong. I also think there's opportunities at the state level. So what will happen in the US in many ways, I think, is that the economic development activity is really going to be happening at the state level. California, New York, Massachusetts, these are states where, the activity in Washington has now moved toward, money has moved out. The states are really in the driver's seat. So finding opportunities for connectivity there. And then third, I think with companies, I think, again, I know a number of companies where there is a lot of interest in helping rebuild, and really the opportunity, and we have to talk about opportunity here, is to leapfrog in some of this technology in the rebuilding. So for example, what we see is the use of additive manufacturing, right, which helps reduce the number of parts, a much more efficient way of making things. To what extent is Ukraine rebuilding its manufacturing capabilities, using some of the advanced technology that frankly has been used on the battlefield today? So I think that's important. I also would say I would not discount the philanthropic community in the US. We have a large, because our society is so, what do I want to say, supportive of people making money and becoming, billionaires. We have a private sector philanthropic sector that I think should be also hopefully part of the conversation with Ukraine. But I'm happy to get into more detail on that offline. What do we see currently? I'm happy to be kind of a conduit to the extent that I can be, as to kind of what are the ways for that connection. But I would emphasize also that I think thinking about this in terms of both regions, which you are familiar, rebuilding particular cities and regions, thinking about the assets in those places, is one approach. And then the other is through verticals. How do we rebuild? Tim was just talking about software. How do we think about advanced manufacturing? How do we think about critical minerals? What are the areas that Ukraine, from an economic development point will be participates in? And again, how can they leapfrog on technology and advance post-conflict? Hopefully that's, if anybody, if you want to, we can continue that conversation online or offline. Let me go to the second question here. This is a very interesting. In your opinion, will the attraction of labor migrants to Ukraine affect the return of the local population that was evacuated abroad? What tools should be implemented to return the population of Ukraine from abroad? Very important question, obviously. And I have been on the other side of programs like in the US, that have provided, some Ukraine immigrants a landing, if you will, in the U.S. At least in the near term. I think the program that Ukrainians have come in to the U.S. under, a refugee program, provides about 2 years of support and workforce. This is a really challenging area because, of course, people have had to, their lives have been completely disrupted, and they have, had to adjust. And, better than I do what the feelings are about coming back and what the challenges are for people in that. I think that obviously it's going to be as quickly as people can actually find jobs and find meaningful work that will help with this transition. So there may be a demand pull. Obviously, how do we attract people back to Ukraine? And also, frankly, can we attract, those who want to help rebuild the country? I think there's a law, a calling for that. There may also be a supply push side, like Trump in the U.S. is going to end this program that we've had in the U.S., this 2-year refugee program. He's made clear that it will no longer be used, whether it's for Ukrainians, Afghanis, Venezuelans. So there may be, that there are going to be some doors that possibly will close going forward that may also help accelerate whether the Ukrainians are coming back to the population. But, I think you're trying to attract, it seems to me, any and all of the immigrants to come back and help rebuild. And so the incentives to do that will hopefully be there, along with the more public will to do that. I've got a couple more questions. Natural resources are an important resource for Ukrainian communities. What advice can you give on how to qualitatively analyze them and find growth points? I cannot emphasize how important this critical mineral natural resource area is right now. You all are probably well aware of this, but we have a consortium at MIT of some of the leading mining companies, sort of the very upstream companies in this. And the joke is that mining has become sexy. And that is because everyone has understood how essential these natural resources are, and that we've got a geopolitical landscape in which developing, alternatives to China is important. And so there's a lot of work going on in this area. I would encourage us first and foremost to find ways in which MIT and Ukraine can work in this space. But what we see is that there's a number of different ways in which people are looking at this. One is just how do we access more? We do need, more minerals and more refining. But the other is how do we bring in new technology so that we can both think about, more efficient, more sustainable processes, and including recycling, and how do we get higher throughput, if you will, higher yield. So I think that this is, figuring out exactly where Ukraine's competitive advantage is, and then looking ahead. What we're seeing a lot in the US right now in this space are the use of techno-economic models. So, okay, we understand that there's a market here. What are the multiple pathways in which Ukraine could compete, and how does new technology actually change that equation? How does opportunities globally and shifting market demand change that opportunity? And so a little bit of sort of changing the way we look at the mining, natural, I'm going to say mining, but I know that's broader than that, but natural resource equation, given, again, the use of AI now, and the changes in geopolitical landscape. I think that we have to take a new approach to the natural resources and commodity areas and think about ways to do this differently than we have before, because there are a lot of ways to be more resilient, more sustainable, and more digital. All of those apply to the natural resource industry as much as they apply to manufacturing. Ole, I see your hand up.
дозволу хочу запитати.
I have a question from my side. The question, maybe it will be interesting for all other participants. So we have a great potential with the agricultural sector. So how to attract big processing companies so that we do not sell grains, but we can sell the final product, end product, and to the country. So yeah, we are growing, our population is growing, and unfortunately robotics will not substitute working hands, but all of us have to eat, we need to feed our families. And the second part of our question is that during our war we have a great logistical potential, I would say. I mean, between the Northern Europe and between Black Sea and other countries of the Eastern Europe and Middle East. So these are just two directions. So in your opinion, do you see for Ukraine a place in the world global processes which can be unique so that our communities could target to this process? Maybe it's a complex question, sorry for that, but I'm really interested in that.
You know what? I think all questions for Ukraine are going to be complex for a little bit here. So, so certainly, I think on both of those dimensions. So I think in terms of specifically to agriculture, and then also in terms of what I call the geopolitical strategic value of Ukraine, those are both significant. And the opportunities, you know, again, with some certainty going forward, my feeling is that we're going to see a real interest globally in the rebuilding of Ukraine and the positioning of Ukraine in a secure place going forward in the world. Agriculture is a very, I think, interesting dynamic. Again, Ukraine has been a supplier, an important supplier in the global economy. But there again, we also are seeing how can we bring new technology to make a more efficient, more sustainable processes, you know, with fertilizers, et cetera. And so I feel my feeling is, to the extent that Ukraine has had and you know, will have a lot of these multinationals, it is obviously an area driven by multinationals, you know, how to partner with some of those companies so that they can be an investor in positioning Ukraine going forward. You know, we had, obviously there's been a lot of adjustment and concerns. We've seen a whole host of supply chain issues in the agricultural sector, but at the same time, we're also seeing a lot of investment. Bioag, very important. And again, I think Ukraine, positioned as a country with a strong skill base, right? A highly educated workforce, you know, positioning for this 21st century change in the ways in which we address natural resources, the way in which we're producing food, the ways in which we can bring, you know, a new approach to how we do this is going to be valuable, going to be an opportunity for the country in a way that other countries, where the impetus to do that is not going to be as obvious in other places. So, you know, my hope is that certainly in North America, where we have also strong agricultural industries, both the US and Canada, that there would be opportunities for large multinationals to say, what's the opportunity for rebuilding and also investing in Ukraine. In terms of course, Europe and North-South, you know, others are experts in that domain. But I think that we have to agree that Europe is completely rethinking its approach to national security, and that Ukraine is going to be part of that conversation. And also, I will say from a defense point of view, again, a lot has been learned through this terrible conflict, and a lot has been learned about technology, about defense, about what's needed going forward, and Ukraine is at the center of that learning. So my hope is that conversation continues, and that it's, you know, Ukraine is part of the larger conversation. As I said, this is now, you know, it's a global priority. It's a priority in Europe and a priority in North America. And Ukraine, has connectivity to both of those economies and both of those sort of geopolitical landscapes.
Я говорю про, швидше всього, дуже дякую за відповідь.
Thank you for this response. I think
Як залучити
about the attraction of the companies who will have the deep procession of the agricultural products, so that Ukraine could not be just the provider of the raw material, but the supplier of the end material, especially for the upcoming new markets which are growing. And the question is how to knock at the door, how to do it in the right manner. And the second part of my... Please answer, Liz.
Okay, sure. Well, so look, I think this idea of moving up the value chain in commodity products is, of course, what many countries have tried to do over the years, and some have been quite successful. And it is both I think it's a collaboration with industry, but it's also a collaboration with academia. Often, we need to see to make that transition is about innovation, and it's about a skilled workforce, and it's about an ability to, not just move, I think, from a pure markets point of view, but also from a technology point of view. So you have to show the capabilities. Many countries are not in a position to do this, right? Ukraine is in a position to do this. I think of, I don't know if, there's parallels ever drawn with Ireland, but Ireland also started, if I think about the biotech industry, started out very much far from the innovation, basically provided tax breaks for everybody to go make their drugs there. So I used to joke, my PhD was on the globalization of biomanufacturing. And I said the US is losing jobs to Ireland and Switzerland, not to China, it was to Ireland and Switzerland, because they had a higher educated workforce and they were providing these massive tax breaks. And so the companies went and set up their facility there. And then slowly but surely over time, Ireland started building the capabilities to do the higher value added work. And so that you moved up the value chain from not just the end production, which, by the way, is a fairly skilled process in biopharma, but into the innovation and into the R&D. And so now that Ireland in the biopharma space has moved up that supply chain. And they've done it, the first way they started getting those companies to move in was very economic, was very much through these tax breaks. But now I think they are in a position now where that economy has now expanded into, into higher value added work. So I think, again, it is, in the end, it's about the knowledge capabilities, which, again, Ukraine is very strong here. And so how do we start knocking on those doors and building that capability? It might be about finding parallel examples where other countries have done this and saying, what's the strategy we need? Where do we start? And who are which companies are willing to, place a bet and be part of that process for Ukraine. And I'd be happy to sort of, think about what are the, to the extent I know folks, at least in North America, what does that look like? What can be done? I'm not an expert in the ag space, but I certainly know that the pressures, the opportunity to bring in more of the biotechnology in ag, as well as the pressures on sustainability, are changing the equation for how people will be thinking or are thinking about production going forward. Hopefully that's helps, Ole, but again, it's possibly a longer conversation, but that moving up the supply chain is one that does, in the end, requires not only the demand pull, industry that's willing to do it, but also a supply side, which is technology and education and, how do we improve our processes beyond where they are today.
Є ще одне питання.
We have one more question.
Дуже довго
We are not gonna torture you with questions, but we are just mesmerized with your lectures. Very important and very interesting. So we have one question in our chat. That is in your opinion, probably, yeah?
I see it. So which sectors of the economy will develop the fastest
Yes,
after the
Отже,
war?
які сектори будуть розвиватися швидше? Які сектори? Sorry.
Yeah, no, not at all. So I think we have to think about this, you know, again, I don't feel like I'm an expert in the Ukrainian economy per se, but I think that broadly speaking, as I said, I think what we're seeing in Europe and in North America is a real investment in an advanced manufacturing base. So in our ability to actually make advanced products. And so I mean, I know Europe is having some shakeup in terms of the auto industry, but I think that in general, this manufacturing capabilities and Ukraine's ability to participate in that will be very important. The other, of course, is going to be anything related to AI. We're seeing a lot of that adoption across verticals. And so software-related capabilities, again, a strength for Ukraine, will be very important. So I think we're seeing where the competition, where are the areas that we see investment right now. So I think advanced manufacturing, I think clean energy, sustainable products. As much as we might have a change in heart in the US globally, the fact is that there's a lot of investment in clean tech. Critical minerals, another area, again, the world has woken up to the importance of critical minerals and how we're going to sustain the demand, global demand in this area, really important. And there's going to be a lot of demand, as you know, AI centers, et cetera, for compute power. So energy grids, energy production, an area long-term that we can imagine a lot of growth. I also think that there is going to be continued demand in what we call broadly the bioeconomy. So whether that's in biopharma with drugs, whether that's in bioindustrial, right, using wood products, other chemical non-chemical products to replace a lot of the chemical base area, and in bioag. That is now estimated to be a $4 trillion economy by 2040. So that transition into the bioeconomy will be happening. And I will say, again, I think that the geopolitics will really shape that in different ways that may play to Ukraine's strength. But for example, right now, a number of biotech drugs for the US are made in China and imported to the US. Currently, we have Congress has been talking about giving biopharma companies 8 years to stop making in China and move production elsewhere to serve the US market. We can imagine, that kind of dynamic happening across a number of different areas. So hopefully that gives a sense for, what I see as important areas. And of course, I think food processing and, as you said, the agricultural areas, I think we're just going to continue to see demand on that space as well.
Я хочу сказати, що Україна
I would
буде
like to
мати
say that Ukraine is going to have
виміри сприйняття
their own dimensions of the perception of Asian countries.
країни, яка може готувати.
I mean, the country who can feed.
Це питання
And
логістики для Північної
it's
Європи,
also about the Ukraine will be logistics for the Europe
Це цікавий
and for the
процес
Northern Europe. Ukraine will be a
сільськогосподарської
very
і
interesting
інших
partner in the agriculture and in other
Але зараз
things for
з'являється
Northern
нова
America.
логіка, на жаль,
But also we have another role emerging, which was brought about in course of the war. It's like fort post or
стіна оборонна між Азією
our
і
fortress between Asia and Europe. Ukraine will be this fortress. So of course there also can be other opportunities because there is no other wall. no other fortress. Europe is not ready to be at the forefront as Ukraine is standing up. And we see a lot of opportunities within the military market. We see a great interest from the Northern European companies who are ready to invest into the military production here. And also, I have a question. Is the global world ready to take this military experience from us, from Ukraine? So what is the perspective for the industrial economy?
Yeah, particularly, Ole, on the question of the military question, is that your perspective? Meaning, is the US, or is the world, yes.
Оборону і оборону, і
Yes,
зброю.
defense and weapon production, etc.
Yes, I mean, you know, I can't tell you, I don't think I can underscore enough how the Ukraine conflict has brought home for the US, one, how much innovation is happening on the front line, real time. You know, things are being figured out and tested in Ukraine that they haven't been anywhere else in the world. And so a lot of learning has gone on, which means it's, you know, Ukraine has been a partner in that, but it's also underscored how far, you know, where the vulnerabilities are for the country. So I think Ukraine has proven itself to be such a partner in this in so many ways that will hopefully continue. And again, a number of the companies that you have working, US companies that are supplying Ukraine, will be and should be the partners of Ukraine going forward. I mean, the things we're learning are now, you know, part and parcel of the Ukraine military industrial base. So I think it's, you know, this is the frontier, sadly, but the reality is Ukraine is at the frontier of innovation in defense. And what's been understood in the US, as I showed earlier, is that, you know, we're not at all anywhere where we need to be as a country. And so learning from Ukraine and investing and partnering with Ukraine, I hope is part of the future. I will say, you know, one of the most complicated and Byzantine organizations in the United States is the Department of Defense. And they recognize that they are hard to work with. And they've had trouble bringing innovation into the department. And so, in fact, they have a team, a defense innovation board right now that's looking at how do they work with startups? How do they work with innovative companies? You know, rather than what we have is, you know, 5 large companies that are very much locked in the market. And so, again, Ukraine is an example of speed, agility, innovation, the place to test new products, the ways in which startups have actually been able to gain traction. All of that should be something that Ukraine can take forward to position itself as a partner in defense industrial base, which, as you know, is a priority not only in the US, but also in Europe.
Я бачу, що до нас питань немає. І
I see
хотілося б
this, we don't have any more question. So I would like to say thank you for this complex, multifaceted, diverse information, because, you know, we think that we know something, we have knowledge, right? But when we hear from such people from the outside, right, we really you made us broaden our horizons. And I understand that the global world cannot just, you know, leave Ukraine alone without any demand, etc., and without no offer for us, I'm sure. And I think that your lecture really brought about a lot of food for thought, our internal discussion, and maybe internal self-confidence that there will be growing interest to Ukraine, and we have to find something, and we have to set the direction where we need to grow from the inside, whether we export grain or we process it or we make this end product, etc. We have to ask ourselves, are we ours who will produce weapon, or we are gonna be exporter? So these are the questions, and these are the food for thought. I appreciate your input, and I think that maybe, yeah, today we had 2 lectures, and I am sure that we heard these practical, implied things which are remote for our communities, yeah, but I think they set the opportunities for our country. And I very often reiterate that for our participants, we have 45 today with us, you know, they do not leave, yes, they await for the end, and they are so involved, and your lecture was another bead for our future recovery necklace, and we will remember about your necklace. And I know that you're open for communication, and we can reach out. And people, our lecturers, these are those who invest in partnership and in trust. Thank you for that.
Thank you so much, Paula. I appreciate your kind words, and I hope everybody on this Zoom sees me and sees MIT as a partner going forward. We very much look forward to working with you and supporting you in any way that we can. So all the best, and look forward to staying in touch.
Для нас це велика честь і дуже
It's a
дякую.
great honor to have you. Thank you.
I wish I knew how to say goodbye in Ukrainian. I'll work on that for the next time we're together.